The river tunnel groaned like a living thing when the first support gave way. Concrete dust rained from the ceiling. Somewhere in the dark, a pipe snapped with a gunshot crack, and brown water burst through the wall in a violent sheet. "Mason! It's coming in!" the boy yelled from his shoulders. Mason Cole tightened his grip on the kid's legs, feeling the thin metal of leg braces dig into his collarbone. The water was already up to his shins, icy, and pushing hard, swirling around the toppled work lights and loose rebar. Sirens screamed faintly at the far end of the tunnel, muffled by the roar of rushing water and the echo of his own pounding heart. On the other side of the floodgate door, men were beating on the steel with something heavy. They weren't here to rescue him. They were here to silence him. "Keep that phone up, Noah," Mason shouted, voice hoarse. "They're still watching." The boy's trembling hand held the cracked phone high. Live stream still rolling, red icon blinking. Thousands of people, maybe more by now, were seeing exactly what Mason had been screaming about for years: leaking seams, rusted rebar, falsified inspection tags, stamped with a very familiar logo. The logo of the richest man in Riverton. The same man who called Noah his son. A surge of water slammed into Mason's waist, almost knocking him off his feet. He staggered, caught himself on a twisted rail, and glared at the dark camera lens like it was the eyes of the whole city. "You cut corners on safety," he growled into the phone. "You lied. You put every family in this town under a river held up by rotten steel. This is on you, Barrett. All of it." The door buckled as the men outside started to pry it open. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from tonight and hit that like and subscribe button if you believe courage still matters in this world. Mason Cole didn't start his life planning to fight billionaires in a flooding tunnel. Most days, he was just the quiet guy in grease-stained coveralls at the back of the Riverton Transit Yard. At 37, Mason had the look of a man who'd been sanded down by life. Strong shoulders, tired eyes, hands scarred from years of turning wrenches. He clocked in before sunrise, fixed buses until evening, and then went home to a small rental on the west side where his 9-year-old daughter Lily waited with homework spread across the kitchen table. Once he'd worn hard hats and collared shirts, walked job sites with a tablet in his hand. Structural engineer. City contracts. Bridges, parking decks, the original design team for this very river tunnel. Then a support beam failed on a parking structure downtown. 2 cars crushed. 1 man killed. Someone had to take the fall. The company blamed field miscalculations. Mason's name was on the drawings. By the time the lawyers were done, his license was suspended, his reputation ruined. His wife, Jenna, held the pieces of him together as long as she could. Cancer didn't care about any of that. By the time Mason signed the last hospice form, he'd lost his career and the love of his life in less than a year. So he shrank his world down to something he could control. A stable union job at the Transit Authority. A worn-out little house with pictures of Jenna on the walls. Breakfast with Lily every morning no matter what. Fix what's in front of you. Don't make waves. Keep your head down. That was the rule. Until the Wednesday night, he found the boy asleep on his bus. Route 7 was his last run of the day. Rain had come in cold and steady off Lake Erie, blurring the neon of downtown Riverton into smeared streaks of red and gold on the windshield. The bus was mostly empty by the time he turned into the depot, air brakes, hissing engine rumbling low. Mason did his usual walkthrough. Check for forgotten purses, backpacks, the occasional fast food bag. He reached the back row and froze. A skinny kid, maybe 11, lay curled across the seat. Dark hair, oversized hoodie, metal braces running down both legs to worn sneakers. He clutched a leather satchel tight to his chest, like somebody might rip it away in his sleep. "Hey, buddy," Mason said softly. "End of the line." The boy's eyes snapped open, hazel and full of panic. For a second, he didn't seem to know where he was. Then he saw the transit yard out the window and went even paler. "I can't go home," he blurted. "Please don't make me go back there." Mason straightened, a familiar ache pulling at his chest. He recognized that kind of fear. He'd seen it in hospital rooms. He'd seen it in the mirror. "Okay," he said slowly, holding both hands up in peace. "You're not in trouble. Let's start with your name." The boy hesitated, fingers digging into the satchel strap. "It's Noah," he whispered. "Noah Barrett." The last name hit Mason like a punch. In Riverton, there was only one Barrett that mattered. Rain swept across Riverton the next morning, a cold Lake Erie wind rattling the loose siding on Mason's little rental. He stood in the kitchen with a mug of black coffee, staring at the steam like it might offer answers. Noah slept curled up on the pull-out couch in the living room, braces leaning against the wall, the leather satchel tucked under his arm even in sleep. Mason hadn't touched the satchel. He hadn't asked questions. Not yet. The kid had clung to it like oxygen, and Mason remembered too well how it felt to hold the last thing that made you feel safe. He glanced at the clock. Lily would be up soon. He'd need to figure out how to explain a strange boy in their living room before school drop-off. He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Dad." He turned. Lily stood in the hallway, hair-mussed unicorn pajamas drooping at one shoulder. She looked from him to the couch and blinked. "Who's that?" Mason crouched and tucked one of her curls behind her ear. "A boy who needed a place to stay last night." "His name's Noah." "Is he okay?" "Working on it," Mason said softly. Lily walked past him, silent as a whisper, and set her favorite blanket pink with faded stars beside the sleeping boy. Then she tiptoed back and whispered, "Don't tell him I did that." Mason felt something tighten behind his ribs. "Okay, sweetheart." But he had no idea how to keep any of this contained. And by noon that day, the world began pulling the threads apart. Transit. Superintendent Neil Hartford cornered Mason in the garage bay after he clocked in. The man always looked like he smelled something sour, thin mouth, thin tie, thin patience. Cole Hartford barked. "My office. Now." Mason wiped grease from his hands and followed him in. The office smelled like burnt coffee and cheap carpet glue. Hartford shut the door, crossed his arms, and leaned on the desk. "I got a complaint last night. Passenger says there was a kid on your bus after hours. Claims you let some runaway ride for free. That you brought him into the depot." Mason stiffened. "Who filed it anonymous?" Hartford's eyes narrowed. "Which is worse, frankly. Makes it look like someone's scared to put their name on it." Mason didn't move, didn't blink. "Look," Cole Hartford said, lowering his voice. "I've been patient with you. You're a good wrench turner, but you got history. The city remembers that garage collapse. They remember you were involved." There it was, always waiting in the wings. "I didn't cause that failure," Mason said quietly. "Doesn't matter," Hartford snapped. "Optics do, and right now it looks like you're bringing unauthorized people into city property. You know the policy." Mason set his jaw. The kid was cold and scared. "I wasn't going to throw him out onto the street in the rain." Hartford sighed, like he couldn't believe he had to explain basic humanity to Mason. "Cole, you need to understand something. You're barely holding on to this job. One bad step and you're gone. I can't have..." Strays following you in. Mason felt the words dig in deeper than he expected. Not because Hartford was wrong about the job, Mason knew his security was stapled together with nothing but seniority and union rules, but because Hartford's voice carried the same tone he'd heard during the investigation into the parking collapse. The tone of someone who already decided who the weak link was. Is that all Mason asked? Hartford hesitated. Keep your nose clean, Cole. Seriously, I'm trying to help you here. Mason walked out without answering. Lunch break found him outside in the cold, sitting on a bench overlooking the maintenance yard. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He let it buzz twice before answering. Yeah. A man's voice, velvet smooth and thick with practiced confidence, filled his ear. Mason Cole. He froze. Every instinct told him to hang up. You found my son last night, the voice continued. He is not a runaway. He is ill, vulnerable, and he needs to be returned to where he belongs. Mason swallowed. Who is this Samuel Barrett? The name hit like a hammer. Owner of Barrett Consortium. Philanthropist. Mayor's biggest donor. The kind of man who could pave or bury entire careers with a single call. And the father of the boy sleeping on Mason's pull-out couch. My son requires medical evaluation, Barrett continued. You may think you're helping, but you're not. Please tell me where you're keeping him, and I'll send a car. Mason steadied his breath. Noah said he didn't want to go home. He's confused. Barrett's tone sharpened. He doesn't understand the situation. You do not have custody rights, Mr. Cole. Harboring him is unlawful. Mason pressed his fist to his thigh. He was terrified. He imagines things Barrett said flatly. The boy has episodes. He needs professional care, not whatever scrap metal sanctuary you pulled him into. A hot flush rose in Mason's face. But before he could speak, Barrett's voice softened artificially. You've endured hardship, Mr. Cole. Lost your license. Lost your wife. I admire your effort to build something stable again, but you're not equipped to make decisions for a child like mine. Do the responsible thing. Tell me where he is. Mason hung up. His hands shook for a full minute before he stood and walked back inside. Lily was quiet after school. Too quiet. She sat at the kitchen table doing math homework, but Mason could see the tension in her shoulders the way she glanced toward the living room, where Noah sat, propped on the couch, reading one of Mason's old engineering manuals. You okay, Bug? Mason asked. Lily fiddled with her pencil. Miss Carpenter called me up today, she murmured. She asked why you had a hurt boy at home. She said another parent saw him get out of your truck this morning. Mason exhaled slowly. What did you tell her I said he was your friend? Lily's voice cracked. But she looked at me like we were lying. Mason's chest tightened painfully. One little spark of gossip, the runaway kid, the disgraced former engineer, the widower, raising a daughter alone, and suddenly he was a rumor again. A liability again. He knelt beside Lily's chair. You didn't do anything wrong. I know, she bit her lip. But I don't like when people talk like that, like we're bad. Mason brushed her hair back. We're not bad. We just don't have the kind of money that makes people pretend they don't see cracks. Lily didn't understand, not fully, but she nodded anyway and leaned against him. Across the room, Noah watched, eyes downcast. He looked like someone who'd seen this kind of judgment before. Too much of it. That evening, Mason made spaghetti, while the boys sat at the table. Noah kept one hand on that leather satchel, like it was keeping him tethered to the earth. You want to tell me what's in there? Mason asked gently. Noah stiffened. No. Mason nodded. Fair enough. After dinner, Mason stepped outside to take the trash out. Rain misted down soft and cold. When he turned back toward the house, a car sat at the end of his driveway. Black, idling, windows tinted. His stomach dropped. Two men stepped out. Not thugs, not goons, men in tailored wool coats, polished shoes, and calm, expressionless faces. Mr. Cole, one said, voice professional, but firm. "We're here on behalf of Mr. Barrett. We'd like to speak with the boy." "No," Mason said immediately. The man's jaw twitched. "This is a family matter, sir. You're interfering. I don't care." The second man took one step forward. "You don't want trouble." Mason felt a deep, old anger stir in his bones, an anger he'd stuffed down for years to keep from losing everything. "Trouble already found me." "Get off my property," he said quietly. The first man held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once. They returned to the car and drove away. But Mason knew they'd be back. Men like that didn't take no as a final answer. He walked inside to find Noah standing in the hallway, pale as moonlight. "They came for me," the boy whispered. Mason crouched so their eyes met. "You're safe here." Noah hesitated. His throat bobbed. Then he opened the satchel. Inside were papers, blueprints, a hard drive, and a thick folder stamped with the Barrett Consortium security seal. "My dad's building a new tunnel under the river," Noah whispered. "And he's cheating. Skipping safety stuff. Lying to the city." Mason's blood chilled. "The braces on my legs," Noah said, voice trembling. "They're from when part of the old tunnel collapsed during one of his secret tests. They said it was a ground shift accident. But I saw the real report." He held up the folder with shaking fingers. "That tunnel will collapse if they open it. They'll blame the crews. They'll blame everyone except him." Mason's breath caught. This wasn't a runaway situation. It was a cover-up. A big one. Down the hall, Lily peeked out, eyes wide and frightened. She heard the words. The fear. The danger. Mason reached for her shoulder, grounding her and himself as he stared at the folder in Noah's hands. "We have to show someone," Mason said. "No," Noah whispered, eyes filling with panic. "You don't understand. They'll come after you too." A gust of wind rattled the house, sending a shiver through the windows. Mason closed the satchel, steadied his voice, and looked at both kids. "They already have." He stood, spine straightening in a way it hadn't in years. Outside, a black car turned the corner. Slow, deliberate, circling back. Pressure pressed in from all sides. Job threatened reputation, cracking again. Daughter frightened a boy, carrying evidence that could drown an entire company. And Mason realized something he hadn't admitted to himself since the day his engineering license was taken away. You can only stay quiet for so long. The storm hadn't broken yet, but it was coming. Mason barely slept. Every creak of the old house jolted him upright, heart hammering. By dawn, a gray light spread across Riverton, cold and flat, washing the quiet streets in a metallic haze. He sat at the kitchen table with blueprints spread out between his hands, the ones Noah had shown him. The evidence was damning. Rusted supports misrepresented as reinforced steel, stress tests falsified, warnings buried, and the new tunnel was scheduled to open tonight. Noah sat across from him, clutching his satchel. Lily leaned against Mason's shoulder, still in pajamas, eyes heavy with worry. "Dad," she whispered. "What are we gonna do?" Mason stared at the diagrams. Lines and numbers he used to understand instantly now swam in front of him. He'd promised himself he'd never get involved with structural engineering again. Never get near a job site. Never relive the night the investigation panel told him he'd failed a building he knew he hadn't. But people were going to be in that tunnel tonight. Dozens of workers, maybe hundreds during the opening demonstration. And if the leaks Noah talked about were real, he forced the thought down. Lily tugged his sleeve. "Daddy." He folded the papers. We're going to stop it, he said quietly, one way or another. Noah swallowed hard. My dad won't let you. He'll send more men. Worse ones. Mason slid a steady hand onto the boy's shoulder. He's not the only one who knows this place. He grabbed his jacket, his old engineering badge, the one he never threw away, and his toolbox. Lily rose too quickly, panic in her face. You're going to the tunnel, aren't you? He knelt and squeezed her hands in his. I have to. If I don't, people could die. Tears welled in her eyes. But you said you'd stay safe now. You promised. The words hit deeper than anything else could have. I know, sweetheart, he whispered. And I will try. I swear it. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. Noah looked up. I'm going with you. Mason shook his head. Absolutely not. You won't get inside the site without me, Noah insisted. They won't listen to you. They'll say you're lying. Mason opened his mouth to argue, but he knew the kid was right. Barrett's men would swarm him before he got anywhere near the site. But a father seeing his son's security wouldn't question that. And besides, Noah knew where the weak points were. He'd read the buried reports. He'd seen the maintenance schedules. The boy was the key. Mason blew a long breath out his nose. Fine, he said. But you stay behind me at all times. Noah nodded. Lily clung to Mason. Please come back. I will, he said, though the storm building in his gut whispered a different story. The Riverton River Tunnel project rose from the riverbank like a concrete skeleton, half lit by towering construction lights. Dozens of contractors hustled across scaffolds, forklift beepers echoed, and the hum of industrial generators throbbed in the morning air. Mason parked far from the main gate. A black sedan was already stationed there, Barrett's men. Two stood by the security booth, scanning every vehicle that moved. Noah adjusted his braces and tightened the straps on his satchel. They'll believe I'm here for an inspection with you. Mason rubbed his jaw. Let's hope. They walked toward the gate. One guard stepped forward, hand hovering near his jacket. Sir, this is an active site. Public access is restricted. I know, Mason said, keeping his tone steady. I'm here for a final structural check, and I brought Noah Barrett for medical review per Mr. Barrett's orders. The guard stiffened at the name. You're with Barrett Mason, tapped his faded engineering badge. Formerly, he said, but I was called back in because of last night's leak reports. The guard's brows pinched. He hadn't heard anything about a leak. Good. That meant the upper brass was hiding it. Another guard leaned down toward Noah. Your father didn't mention anything, kid. Noah didn't blink. He doesn't mention a lot of things. Something in the boy's tone made both guards pause. Finally, one waved them through. Fine. But stay in the observation corridor. No wandering. They stepped inside the tunnel. Cold air rushed past their faces. Massive steel ribs arched above them, disappearing into shadow. The sound of water pumps echoed down the length of the corridor. The river groaned on the other side of the wall, deep and ominous, vibrating faintly under their feet. Section C, Noah whispered. That's where the cracks were. They hurried down the walkway until they reached a sealed maintenance hatch. A yellow tag hung from the latch. Mason tore it off. What are you doing? A voice barked behind them. He spun around. A site supervisor in a bright orange vest stormed forward, hands on hips. Who the hell are you? That hatch is restricted. I'm reinstated under temporary emergency review, Mason said, showing his badge. The supervisor squinted. You're that engineer they suspended years ago, aren't you? Mason held still. I'm the one who knows where your supports will fail. The man scoffed, but Noah stepped forward. Sir, either you let him check the hatch, or this entire tunnel could flood on opening night. The supervisor frowned. Flood. There are no flood risks documented. Mason put a hand on the hatch wheel. Then let's open it and prove me wrong. The man hesitated long enough for Mason to spin the hatch open. The door swung inward. A rush of cold, damp air hit them. Inside, a thin line of river water trickled through a seam in the concrete, winding across the floor like a living thread. The supervisor swore under his breath. Where did that come from? Noah pulled a folded sheet from his satchel. Foundation shift report, 3 months ago. The stress readings were in the red. Mason pointed to the far wall. Your reinforcement is misaligned. They used substandard welds. If the pressure spikes, that seam fails. The supervisor's face drained white. I need to call this in. But before he could reach for his radio, a sharp metallic clang echoed through the tunnel. They all froze. The lights flickered. Mason felt the vibration before he heard the sound, the deep groan of steel bending under strain. Get out, he barked. Now. They scrambled back into the main corridor. The overhead lights strobed again. Then alarms erupted, piercing, shrill, echoing through the tunnel like a scream. Pressure breach detected. A robotic voice boomed over the speakers. Section C compromised. Evacuate immediately. Workers dropped tools. People ran toward the exits. The supervisor grabbed Mason's arm. How long do we have? Another groan. Louder. Closer. Minutes, Mason said. Maybe less. Noah tugged him fiercely. Section F controls the backup floodgate. If it closes, the tunnel survives. If it doesn't, the boy couldn't finish. Mason did. The river comes straight through. The supervisor stared. That gate's jammed. We reported it last week. Who ignored it? Mason snapped. The man didn't answer. The alarms crescendoed. Another shudder shook the walls. Noah clung to Mason's sleeve. If the gate doesn't close, we drown. Mason's heartbeat steadied in a way he hadn't felt since before Jenna died. That old part of him, the engineer, the builder, the man who carried weight that wasn't his, rose from the ashes of all the years he'd tried to bury it. Take Noah outside, Mason told the supervisor. Noah's eyes widened. You can't go alone. I know that gate system, Mason said. You don't. But Dad said. Mason cut him off gently. I promised Lily I'd come home. I keep my promises. That wasn't entirely true, but he needed the boy to believe it. He turned and sprinted through the corridor toward Section F. Behind him, people shouted. Metal screeched. Pipes hissed as pressure built against failing seams. The floodgate control room sat behind 2 steel doors. He threw his shoulder into the first, locked. He kicked the emergency override panel wires, spilling out, sparks popping as he twisted them together by memory. The lock clicked. He shoved inside. The floodgate control console blinked with error messages. Red alerts screamed across the touchscreen. Gate jammed. Hydraulics non-responsive. Pressure critical. He slammed a fist on the manual override. Nothing. Come on, he growled. Water sprayed from the ceiling as a pipe ruptured. The river was pushing through the concrete. He was running out of time. He grabbed a wrench from a nearby rack, forced open the maintenance hatch under the console, and crawled into the mechanical pit. Cold mist sprayed his face. He could hear the entire tunnel groaning above him. He found the hydraulic release valve and cranked it as hard as he could. The wheel didn't budge. He put both hands on it, planted his feet, and dragged with everything he had. A memory slammed into him, Jenna in the hospital bed, whispering, "Promise me you'll protect her. Promise you won't disappear into your grief." He tightened his grip. "Not today," he said through clenched teeth. The valve screeched, then turned. Up above the floodgate groaned. The system fought him. Pressure sensors screamed. Hydraulic lines rattled. The wheel stopped halfway. "Come on!" He braced his shoulder against the steel frame. and heaved. Once. Twice. A deafening crack split the air. Then, with a bone-deep shudder, the floodgate slammed into place. Silence fell. Then alarms cut off one by one. The river quieted. The tension in the walls eased. Mason crawled out of the pit, shaking. Soaked. Exhausted. Alive. The supervisor burst into the control room a moment later, followed by Noah, his braces clinking as he ran. "Is it?" Noah gasped. Mason nodded weakly. "It's closed." The boy threw his arms around him. "You saved everyone." Workers crowded into the corridor, staring at Mason with a mixture of disbelief and awe. The power dynamic shifted in that single breath. The disgraced engineer had done what the entire Barrett consortium refused to fix, and the tunnel was safe for now. Far down the corridor, several men in black coats appeared. Barrett's men. They looked shaken, rattled, afraid, because Mason had just survived something they expected would kill him, and he had proof they never wanted seen. The crisis wasn't over, but the balance of power had shifted, and everyone in that tunnel knew Mason Cole wasn't the man they thought he was. He was much, much more. Water dripped from Mason's sleeves as he leaned against the control console, catching his breath. The tunnel lights flickered twice, then steadied into a soft, humming glow. For the first time since the alarms went off, the world felt still, like the river itself was taking a long breath, reconsidering whether it wanted to break through the concrete and swallow the place whole. Workers stood in small clusters down the corridor, their voices hushed, their eyes locked on him. Some held their hard hats against their chests. Others simply stared with their mouths open, as if they were seeing him for the very first time. Noah stayed glued to his side, fingers gripping the edge of Mason's soaked jacket. The kid's braces clicked in nervous rhythm, but his eyes shone with something fierce: relief, pride, disbelief, all tangled together. The site supervisor walked in last, breathing hard. His face was pale, but his voice carried enough weight to reach the men gathered in the corridor. "He closed the gate," the supervisor said hoarsely. "He did it manually, saved this entire structure." A murmur swept through the workers. Someone swore softly, like a prayer. Someone else said, "Holy hell." A few nodded at Mason with the kind of respect normally reserved for seasoned foremen or decorated firefighters. But Mason barely noticed. He was staring at the seam of the wall where the water had been moments before. One layer of concrete, one set of steel ribs, one gate, just one between the river and a catastrophe. One wrong moment, and Lily might have never seen him again. His stomach turned. For a heartbeat, the echoes of the past, the accusations, the headlines, the lawyers, the silence of hospital rooms threatened to drag him under. He forced air into his lungs. "You kept a promise. You're still here." Noah tugged on his sleeve. "Mason, they're coming." Mason followed his gaze. At the far end of the tunnel, the silhouettes of men in black coats appeared, the same two who'd stood outside his house the night before, and three more behind them. They moved with the smooth, practiced certainty of men who weren't here to deal with a structural emergency. They were here for Noah. And for the evidence. The site supervisor saw them too. He took a hesitant step backward. "Those guys, they're not with us." Noah pressed closer. "My father sent them. They'll lie. They'll twist everything. They'll say the leak is fake or that we caused it." Mason straightened slowly, shoulders squaring. "They won't get the chance." The men spread across the entrance, forming a wall of tailored wool and cold expressions. One of them, tall, shaved head, the same one who'd threatened Mason in his driveway, stepped forward. "Mr. Cole," he said smoothly, voice echoing off the tunnel walls. "Impressive work. Truly." A few workers exchanged uneasy glances. "We're here to ensure everything is safe," the man continued, "and to escort young Noah home. His father is extremely worried." Noah's hand found Mason's. Mason didn't give an inch. "He's not going anywhere with you." The man's smile thinned. "I think you misunderstand." "No," Mason said, his voice steadying. "You misunderstand. I was a structural engineer on this project before any of you showed up in your custom coats. I know the codes, I know the layout, and I know when someone is lying about safety for profit." The workers perked up at that. Whispers spread. "Engineer. He used to work here." "I also know." Mason continued that this wasn't an accident. This crack didn't happen overnight. Someone ignored a failure report. Shaved Head didn't blink. Mr. Barrett would be very disappointed to hear such accusations. Disappointed. Mason stepped forward. "People almost died today." The supervisor cleared his throat quietly behind Mason. "Sir, is that true? You were on the engineering team." Mason hesitated. He'd buried that part of himself years ago, buried it under grief, under guilt, under the heavy weight of believing that the world didn't want him building anything ever again. But now the truth pushed its way up his throat and into the damp air of the tunnel. "Yes," Mason said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I helped design the early structural plans for this tunnel, before Barrett's company took over and cut corners to save money." The men in black coats stiffened. The workers looked from Mason to the wall behind him, and then back again. Something inside the crowd shifted. They'd seen him crank that valve. They'd heard the alarms stop. They'd felt the tunnel settle under their boots. He wasn't just some mechanic who stumbled into a crisis. He belonged here among steel and pressure readings and emergency protocols. "How long have you known about structural engineering?" one worker asked. Mason exhaled, long enough to recognize that what happened today wasn't a fluke. The supervisor shook his head in disbelief. I thought you were just the transit guy." "Funny thing about people," Mason said quietly. "They're more than what they lost." Noah looked up at him with something close to awe. The man in black took another step. "Mr. Cole, this is all very touching, but we need to take custody of the boy. Now." Workers shifted again, this time protectively. The supervisor stepped forward, crossing his arms. "No one's going anywhere until the city inspector gets here. I've already radioed for an emergency evaluation." The man in black's jaw tightened. "You radioed who I'm required to report a near breach," the supervisor said. "So I did." The color drained from the man's face. A ripple of fear crossed his men. For the first time, Mason realized something important. They weren't afraid of him. They were afraid of exposure. The man took a slow breath. "Mr. Cole, this is your last warning. Hand over the boy." Noah shrank back behind him. Mason stepped forward, voice low and sharp. "You lay one hand on him, and I swear—" Before he could finish, a new voice rang through the tunnel. "Step away from them." All heads turned. A woman in a gray, city-issued jacket stood at the entrance, hard hat under one arm badge hanging from her pocket, eyes fierce and focused. Inspector Donna Avery, one of the toughest and most respected structural regulators in the state. Her gaze swept the cracked walls, the uprooted hatch, the trickle of water still drying on the floor. Then she looked at Mason, soaking wet, grease-smeared, exhausted, but standing tall. "Who helped you close that gate?" she asked. Mason raised a hand slightly. "I did." Her expression didn't waver. "And who are you?" He opened his mouth, but one of the workers spoke first. "That's Mason Cole," the man said. "He saved all of us." Another worker stepped up behind him. "He used to be an engineer, before Barrett pushed him out." A murmur of agreement spread. Inspector Avery nodded slowly, never taking her eyes off Mason. "Is that true?" He took a breath, letting the weight of the past settle into place without crushing him. "Yes," he said. "I designed the north support schematics on this tunnel. I warned them about the rebar density issues. They fired me when I pushed too hard." Silence fell. Real silence. A silence that felt like the entire tunnel was listening. Then Avery spoke. "You said the gate would have failed. It was jammed," Mason said. "Hydraulics weren't responding. The failure reports were buried." Avery turned on the men in black coats. "Do you have authorization to interfere with an emergency inspection?" They froze. "No," Avery said. "Then you're trespassing. Get out." They didn't move. She reached for her radio. "Security escort these men off the property immediately." This time they moved. Fast. The moment they disappeared down the corridor, Avery faced Mason again, studying him the way someone studies a book with missing pages. "You closed that gate manually," she said. "That shouldn't be possible without training." "I had training," Mason said. "And courage," she added. No one argued. Not even Mason. "Mr. Cole," she continued, "I'd like you to walk me through the failure report. From the beginning. You're clearly familiar with the system." A stunned hush fell over the workers. Not only was the inspector listening to him, she was asking for his help. Shaved Head hadn't been afraid of Mason, but Barrett would be, and Avery had just pulled the pin on something Barrett couldn't stop. Noah eased beside Mason, whispering, "She believes you." Mason looked at the kid, really looked at him, and felt something shift deep inside his chest. Someone believed him again. Someone trusted him again. Someone saw him for who he really was, not a disgraced mechanic or a washed-up engineer, but a man who still cared enough to step into danger when everyone else stepped away. "Mr. Cole Avery," said, breaking his thoughts, "I don't know why you were pushed out, but from where I'm standing, the city made a mistake. I'd like to review your old reports myself. Off the record for now." The weight of her words hit like a jolt of electricity. Respect, validation, a new path opening. But then she added, "The city will need a formal statement. And given what you've said, I suspect this doesn't end with an inspection. It ends with an investigation." Mason knew she was right. This wasn't just about a crack in the wall. It was about the man who caused it, and the boy standing beside him, trembling just slightly as he clutched that satchel of damning evidence. Avery stepped closer. "Mr. Cole, do you understand what comes next?" Mason glanced at Noah, then at the sealed floodgate he'd forced shut with everything he had, then at the workers who owed him their lives. Finally, he lifted his chin. "Yeah," he said. "I do." Because once the truth came out, really came out, nothing in Riverton would look the same again. Not Barrett, not the tunnel, not Mason's quiet life. Inspector Avery's report landed on the mayor's desk before sunrise the next morning. By noon, the city had shut down the entire tunnel project and ordered a federal engineering audit. By evening, Samuel Barrett's lawyers were issuing panicked statements about unforeseen irregularities, and his board of directors was calling an emergency meeting without him. But inside the tunnel, none of that mattered to the workers who'd been there when the walls groaned and the river pushed to come through. All they remembered was the man who stood in freezing water and turned a valve with his bare hands, because no one else could or would. When Mason stepped out of the tunnel with Noah beside him, the men who had watched him risk everything simply parted around him, giving him a path through. No shouting, no cheering, just a quiet, powerful nod from each one, a kind of respect that didn't need words. It was the first time in years Mason didn't feel like he was walking with the weight of a collapsed garage on his shoulders. He felt equal, seen, whole. And Noah stayed glued to him the entire time, leaning into his steady presence like the world had finally given him a safe place to stand. Word traveled fast through Riverton. Too fast. By the time Mason got home that afternoon, neighbors stood on their porches watching his old pickup roll down the street. Some waved. Some looked stunned. A few crossed the road to clap him on the back. "You saved the whole site, Mason. Never knew you were an engineer. About time somebody stood up to Barrett." He accepted the handshakes with a mild awkwardness, grateful but overwhelmed. Noah walked beside him, clutching the satchel of evidence that had shaken an empire. Lily burst out the front door the second she saw him. Daddy Mason scooped her up, lifting her into a hug that felt like a second chance at breathing. She squeezed his neck until her arms trembled. "You came back," she whispered into his shoulder. "Always," he murmured. "Always, bug." She pulled away just enough to look him in the eyes. "Is the boy staying with us?" Mason glanced at Noah. The kid stood on the porch step, looking smaller than he had in the tunnel exhaustion catching up with him. "For as long as he needs," Mason said. Noah's chin wobbled. He tried to hide it. Failed. Mason wrapped an arm around his shoulders and pulled him close. Lily wrapped her arms around both of them, her small frame barely reaching Noah's ribs. For a moment, the three stood together in the soft evening light. A strange, unexpected family, but a real one. Barrett didn't go quietly. His men claimed Mason fabricated the leak. Lawyers insinuated Noah had been manipulated. Publicists floated the idea that Mason was seeking revenge for his past suspension. But none of it stuck. The federal auditors verified every warning Mason and Noah presented. The buried reports, the falsified signatures, the cost-cutting substitutions, and the near breach captured by the tunnel's internal monitors blew apart the claim that everything was within acceptable risk. Within days, shareholders stripped Samuel Barrett of decision-making power. Within weeks, he faced charges for fraud negligence and evidence suppression. And though he tried to keep Noah away from the hearings, the courts overruled him. The boy told the truth. Calm, steady, fearless. Reporters described it as the moment the Barrett empire cracked for good. But Mason saw something else, a child refusing to be silenced by fear ever again. 3 months later, Riverton's transit yard buzzed with an unusual kind of energy. Hartford waited outside his office, shifting from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable. "Mason," he said. When Mason approached, I wanted to talk. Mason braced himself for another reprimand, but Hartford cleared his throat, rubbed the back of his neck, and tried again. "You saved people," he said. "Doesn't matter what the papers say or who's trying to spin what. You saved them, and I treated you like a risk, not a man who knew what he was doing." Mason didn't say anything. Hartford swallowed, eyes dropping. "I'm sorry. For all of it." The words landed softly, not with fireworks, but with the quiet weight of something long overdue. Before Mason could respond, figures stepped out from the City Hall sedan parked nearby Inspector Avery and the Deputy Director of Riverton Infrastructure. Avery nodded. "Mr. Cole, we'd like to offer you a position." Mason blinked. "Doing what? Supervising structural compliance across multiple projects," the Deputy Director said. "Your experience, both past and recent, makes you the best candidate. And frankly, he paused, we need someone who won't look the other way. Hartford looked stunned. Avery's gaze softened. You don't have to answer today, but we hope you'll consider it. Mason glanced toward the bus bay, where Lily waited with a backpack full of homework, and toward the break room where Noah sat sketching a model of the new safety system they'd designed together for fun. Purpose, direction, a chance to fix things instead of running from them. I'll consider it, he said. Avery smiled. That's all we ask. 6 months later, the river tunnel still hadn't reopened. Workers were rebuilding it from the bones outward this time, with the city watching every weld, every pipe, every stress gauge. And Mason Cole was the man holding the clipboard. He stood in a bright hard hat, clean vest, work boots planted on firm ground as he oversaw a new team of inspectors and young engineers. Noah sat nearby on a folding chair legs, stretched out in fresh braces, helping log pressure data on a tablet the city had given him as a thank you. Lily visited after school with her backpack full of snacks and math questions, always claiming the tunnel felt like Dad's second home. Maybe it was. Maybe it always would be. Because here, surrounded by steel ribs and echoing hallways, Mason wasn't the broken man the world once painted him as. Here he was exactly who he was meant to be. A builder, a protector, a father twice over now as Noah's guardianship quietly shifted into adoption papers, waiting on Mason's kitchen counter. Sometimes life gave you back far more than it took. That evening, as the sun slipped across the river and the lights hummed softly inside the tunnel, Noah looked up from the tablet. Do you ever think about the day it almost flooded? He asked. Mason placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Every day. Does it scare you? Mason shook his head. It reminds me that sometimes the moment everything breaks is the moment you finally see who you are. Noah nodded slowly, absorbing it. Lily skipped down the walkway toward them, swinging her backpack and smiling like the whole world was good again. And Mason realized something simple and steady. Home wasn't a house. It wasn't a job. It wasn't even the quiet life he'd once clung to. Home was the people you were willing to run into the fire or the flood for. People worth rebuilding with. People worth choosing. People who chose you right back.